Hi, so my name is Alison Brady. I'm from the UCL Institute of Education, and I'm here to talk to you today about my paper, Experimental Literature and Post-Critique, Reflections on Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is also part of a suite of papers looking at post-critical approaches to education research. So the paper starts with a discussion of Felsky's diagnosis of critique as the dominant mode of interpretation in literary studies, and that this mode of interpretation assumes that there are always hidden meanings to excavate in a text, and that texts are therefore by nature exclusive and coercive, that it's important that readers are not too easily swayed by what they read, but instead that they must maintain a distance between themselves and the text, that this kind of distance or this approach relies on a particular kind of expertise, for example, in counter reading, which is distinct from the ordinary ways that we engage with literature. And Felsky and also the authors of the Post-Critical Pedagogy Manifesto claim that they are not anti-critical, but more so they take issue with the ubiquity of critique as an approach, the extent to which critique is self-perpetuating, insofar as it points to a future emancipation that never arrives, and that it doesn't give us the tools or the means to respond to texts in educational terms. And so part of this paper is discussing this idea of a post-critical approach, what it might mean to affirm rather than debunk a text, what it might mean to have a kind of hope in the present in relation to what is worth preserving in our current educational and reading practices in the university. What I'm particularly interested in is critique not so much as a method, but more so as an orientation, which primes us towards the text with a particular mindset. And this is a mindset that is suspicious, knowing, self-conscious, hard-headed, tirelessly vigilant, even though that is somewhat of a caricature. But the extent to which that kind of mindset has become second nature in the context of academic scholarship. Even though in critique one is already entangled, interdependent, mediated, and connected with the text, they seem to have this suspicious mindset, which also points to a kind of distance between the reader and the text, even though that's not in fact possible. And so my question is, how far is this accepted or encouraged in our engagement with text in the university, for instance, and what might an affirmative post-critical sensibility or orientation look like instead? So I then set out in the paper to outline what post-critique in relation to literature might look like. And again, the point is that critique is an important element of reading, but it is one possible orientation that is infused with particular dispositions, moods, and sensibilities that are in tension with what I called a post-critical approach. Post-critical approaches, instead of distance, they embrace the extent to which the reader and the text are always involved in a kind of narrative entanglement, that what appears in the text is not something inert, but is in part configured on the basis of what we read into a text. And that also the dualism between the everyday and the scholarly in terms of reading is not so sharp as we might like to think. And you might ask, well, what is the use of literature beyond critique? Of course, critique is something that we want to encourage in our students. It's important in the kind of world that many of our students and ourselves live in nowadays. So what is the use of literature if not to cultivate critical dispositions? Well, Mario Masse talks about this and the extent to which literature has the capacity to draw us towards what she calls other promises of existence. It allows us new ways of thinking and conceptualizing ourselves, the situations that define us, and it also invites us into new perceptual capacities, drawing our attention to reorienting and sharpening our tools to apprehend the world. So it involves a kind of inward transformation in terms of how we understand ourselves, but it also involves an outward transformation in terms of our relationship in the world and what appears in the world to us in light of that. This, Masse argues, requires a kind of radical passivity, even though this is often discouraged in education. So as a way to kind of explore this further, I turn to the text Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which is a difficult text to describe, but in the sort of basic sense, it contains different accounts of Marco Polo, who is describing the vast empire of Kublai Khan. So he's in a conversation with Kublai Khan, and he's giving all of these very imaginative recollections of the cities that he has apparently visited. It's not quite clear whether these are real cities or not, and there's a strange intermingling of fact and fiction throughout the text. And so we have lots of descriptions of these cities, which have been categorized in the text in particular ways. And these descriptions are interrupted by exchanges between the two characters. Often a lot of the critical literature focuses on those exchanges. What I'm more interested in is the description of the cities. Invisible Cities itself has not been without criticism, but a lot of times these criticisms relate to what is outside of the text, or the relationship between the text and its wider context. My concern in the paper is more about what is made available within the text itself, within the kind of descriptions that Marco gives of the cities. In the paper, I reflect on my own failures in offering a post-critical account, and this comes back to the idea that critique is so ingrained in scholarly practices that it's very difficult to escape. It seems to kind of erupt in any sort of attempts we make to describe literature in the context of an academic paper. So I talk about this idea of me trying to identify Kublai Khan as a critical reader, searching for a kind of keystone that will unlock the meaning behind Marco's accounts. But by kind of obsessing over what Marco really means, he forecloses other transformative possibilities that might be made available to him, in the same way that a critical reader forecloses different transformative possibilities by remaining distant and suspicious and consistently looking for the true meaning behind the text. But all of a sudden, it seems that I've slipped into critique. I have a particular aim in mind. I want to show that the Kublai Khan is a critical reader, and I tear the text apart for different metaphors and analogies to support my suspicion. And in doing so, I'm also closing myself off to other potentialities that might be made available in the text. So instead of offering a post-critical response, what I then do instead is signal what I refer to as Calvino's authorial gestures. So different gestures, styles, techniques that he uses in the text that allow for a post-critical response, or that at least pushes back against a purely critical interpretation. And so I take us through some examples of this in the text. The idea that the text is an agent that is involved in its own reconstruction. It sort of offers us lots of tantalizing clues that will unlock the meaning behind Marco's descriptions, but it consistently pushes back on this. And so we're always left in a state of not being able to quite find any linear explanation for what the text is about. There is a playful ambiguity that invites kind of puzzlement and curiosity, and that this is something that if we have a post-critical response, or we approach or we orient ourselves towards the text with a post-critical sensibility, that's something that we might embrace. And that by embracing this, there are all sorts of transformative potentials for not only understanding ourselves, but also for understanding and seeing the cities that we inhabit in new ways, new and imaginative ways. And I argue that this kind of transformative potential, which is really valuable, is best achieved through a kind of open rather than guarded orientation, a reparative rather than suspicious style of reading, and a post-critical rather than critical reader response. So that's my paper in brief, and I'm really excited to hear what you think.